it's tough because you can go to so many kinds of service providers and they just are totally alien. The life you're living is so alien that
Right.
you end up being the educator, and you're like, okay, do we stop the clock while I'm educating you? Because I'm paying you to learn from me.
Welcome to the Ask Ezra Intimacy Coaching Podcast, a peek behind the curtain of some of the most intimate conversations that people have with Ezra as an intimacy coach. Join us for a session already in progress.
So I'd love to ask you a bunch of questions about your practice. So first, what drew you to becoming a therapist, sexologist, coach, and holistic healer?
It's a great question. So I think I've always known that I've wanted to be in this field. I have the sixth grade yearbook, and I can go back to the bio, which is really funny because in the bio, it has like my little picture, and it says that I want to be a psychiatrist, which is ironic because I honestly don't think that I've ever in childhood seen a therapist or a psychiatrist. I just kind of knew that I always wanted to be in the helping field and wanted to interact with people. And I love relationships, kind of the complexity of social dynamics. And in the evolution of like understanding and working with relationships, I discovered that it's really difficult to effectively work with and resolve complex issues romantically and relationally without involving intimacy and sex into the mix. So that was kind of the professional evolution. I think as a field, I'm really drawn to this field in particular because I love intellectual challenge. I love to be challenged with new information, and I love learning. And to kind of maintain competency as a provider, you have to be constantly learning, right? Like not just ethically and legally through CEUs, but just like adapting to every single new dynamic that presents in your room, right? Like every single person, every client is entirely unique. And so the treatment plan and protocol should be totally personalized to who they are and what they need. And I think that kind of challenge is really intriguing to me.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, and I'm a little envious of how like early you figured it out. Because
I feel really lucky that I did.
Yeah, no, I did not. My path is not so straightforward. I studied chemistry.
But hey, you're here now. You're
I
loving it.
am. I'm here now. And okay, the one thing that like really translates, which is wacky, and only people who probably understand physics or chemistry are going to appreciate this, but there's this like concept called activation energy. So if you chart like how much energy is required to progress a reaction, usually it's like it has this like hump, right?
Ooh.
If it doesn't have a hump, then it's like a spontaneous reaction that like happens on its own, like rusting happens on its own. You don't need to like heat up metal to make it rust. It just happens. But a lot of things will have this like hump of energy, and so you have to like heat them up or shake them or something, right? And a catalyst is something that takes that hump and brings it lower, right? And I think of providers, I think of coaches, therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists as catalysts, because they stabilize the intermediate. Because going from I'm not looking at any of my challenges to I looked at all my challenges and now they're settled, there's like a higher point of energy where it's like I'm seeing all the things I need to work on, and I haven't worked on any of them. And so stabilizing that like middle ground is like what a catalyst does. And I think that's kind of what we do, right? We're catalysts for change.
100%. I love that framework. That's fantastic.
Yeah, there you go. So it all comes back to Gibbs free energy.
See, you're using your chemistry.
There
right?
you go.
You're
Yeah.
your background.
One analogy.
Worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. You have so many roles. And so I'm interested in how do the boundaries and expectations conflict between roles, and how do you manage that? Like, do you have like several hats that you literally are like, okay, time to take off the coach hat and turn on the healer hat, right? or how
Yeah.
do you deal with that?
Sometimes it is that clear cut, and it has to be for specific reasons, right? Like therapy can only be provided in states where I'm licensed and the client is physically located. And I'm licensed in a number of states, but I can't provide outside of those state boundaries, right? So the therapist role and hat is very rigid, right? Those boundaries are hard boundaries, they're non-negotiable. But the integrative medicine for mental health, right? Like the herbal supplementation and all of those holistic protocols, that hat can be interwoven into coaching and therapy, as well as the pelvic floor conditioning programming. That role and that hat, that certification can be interwoven into both of those coaching and therapy roles as well. Those are not rigid boundaries. I think the best way to ensure clarity is through transparent and really, really good communication with every single client from the get-go, right? Like that's our job as providers, is to model really effective, streamlined communication from the very, very beginning, right? From the consultation. What is it that they are needing? What is it that they're expecting? If they're familiar with the therapeutic process, what style do they like? Do they like a really direct approach? Is that what they're most responsive to? Or are they a bit more of a sensitive soul and they're needing more of like a client-centered, emotion-focused response from their provider? Are they looking for more brief-oriented and solution-focused approaches, or are they in it for the long haul to really like focus on many different presenting issues, right? Like, and all of that information is super critical to know for me to evaluate what role or roles I'm going to be bringing into the mix. But that all depends on really, really transparent communication from the very beginning.
Does it
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, does it ever like go sideways where somebody's expecting you to be a therapist in a moment and you're being the holistic healer in that moment, or you're being the coach, or you're engaging in the coach and they're expecting a therapist? Does that ever happen?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I always am an advocate for clients being open about what's working and what's not working. I don't take offense to that. I see that as really a wonderful thing, right? Like, as long as it's being done respectfully and we're showing mutual respect and appreciation for one another in that moment. If something's not working for them, if they're not jiving with a theory, concept, orientation that I'm throwing out, this is their time and their space. I don't want for them to sit in it for an hour and then afterwards say, yeah, I didn't really like that. It didn't work for me so much. Interrupt me pleasantly, right? Like, just like,
Yeah.
hey, excuse me, that's really not my style. Is there something else that we can pull from? Totally, absolutely. I take a really eclectic approach. That's kind of my jam. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's definitely been moments when I'm presenting something and it's really not clicking. And that's when the communication is absolutely necessary to make sure that the time that we use, every minute that we use together, is productive and constructive for them. That's the efficacy of the therapeutic process.
Sure. I hear you. I don't have so many roles, and so it's a lot less complicated for me.
Is mentorship something that comprises a pretty significant part of your practice?
I deeply enjoy mentorship. I personally have benefited tremendously from mentorship, and there's like a huge space for mentorship in the BDSM community.
I agree 100%.
It is the smallest fraction that you could possibly imagine. If it was a pie chart, it'd be a straight line. Because with mentorship, it's so specific. It is somebody who wants to be in my shoes, right? Somebody could come to me for mentorship if they wanted to be an author, if they wanted to be a performer, if they wanted to be a sex coach or an intimacy coach, right? And most of the time people need help, but don't have the same goal as me. And that's perfectly reasonable and acceptable, but they're not going to be a good mentor candidate. I had one mentee who wanted to be a professional dominatrix,
Mhm.
and it was enough of a fit, even though I'm not a dominatrix. I do identify as non-binary, so it's not entirely out of the realm of reality, but I was focused on helping them build their physical skills in BDSM. And so, I'm not a woman interacting with male clients, so I can't help with that, certainly. But I was able to say, okay, like, let's get your whip skills up. Let's get your flogging skills up. Let's get your fireplace skills up, and that was deeply rewarding, but, it has a limit to it. And if they find somebody who's like a professional dominatrix, it's going to be a better fit as a mentor. And I'd encourage them to move on and move past it.
Yeah. I think the mentorship opportunities, I mean, they're so needed. I work really heavily with the kink, BDSM, polyamorous communities. I'm no longer in the DMV area, the Maryland, Virginia kind of area physically, but I still work pretty significantly with all the communities down there. And it's very, very common that I get relationship dynamics that are contacting me who are just venturing into exploration of different structures, right? Like they're not even sure what they like and how to start, and starting safely and negotiating appropriately so that we don't injure ourselves emotionally or physically or sexually is super, super critical.
Yeah.
And there are limitations to what I can do as a provider in the roles that I have. So it's really important to have somebody like you kind of as like a referral, as a resource.
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting, I'd say when those situations come up, it ends up being more consultative, right? And so I'm a consultant, and they're not really. I would love to coach those people. I'd love to. I mean, honestly, if all of the mentor needing people came and knocked on my door, I'd be happy to just do that, right? But it usually that is like a one-off or maybe two sessions where it's like, where do we get the resources? Where do we find the tools? And so instead of teaching the tools, I'm basically like helping them create that network of resources so they can get those tools. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then like for a couple, they could even find another couple that's farther along in the path. And so, they can go to their respective counterparts and say, hey man, I'm dealing with this thing. I can't figure out how to do it. Oh yeah, I've been through that. Let me help you. So, mentorship is super important in the community. I'm so lucky. Mistress Cyan St. James, who runs the Sanctuary Studios Dungeon, has been my mentor for almost 10 years now.
Wow.
And it's tremendous. Yeah, it's just,
that's amazing.
Well, it's tough because you can go to so many kinds of service providers and they just are totally alien. The life you're living is so alien that you end up being the educator, and you're like, okay, do we stop the clock while I'm educating you? Because I'm paying you to learn from me. Like,
yeah. And and you either experience bias, right? Like a lot of rejection, whether advertently or inadvertently, or the newness sparks a lot of curiosity, which is exactly what you're talking about. And that's not the purpose of coaching or therapy. That's not the purpose of the space. It's not helpful. It's not conducive to the healing or the growth that the client needs in that moment. So yeah,
like there should be another clock that starts that actually eats away at my fee at like ready, like,
yeah, you're like, can you pay me first and then I'll pay you afterwards after we do the basics, right?
If we do enough educating and therapy, then it just is free.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that arrangement. We can make that work. So I was looking on your website. I was doing a little bit of my homework here, and I saw you mention something about the 8 forms of intimacy. And I would love if you could explain a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we have physical, psychological, experiential, emotional, sexual, social, creative, and intelligent. So those are the 8 forms. Do you want me to go into some examples of those 8, or are they pretty self-explanatory?
I think they're for the most part self-explanatory. Let's go with what is a form of intimacy that seems to surprise people a lot.
Surprise people. Honestly, it's highly variable. It's really dependent on like, so it's very similar to needs or values, right? Are you familiar with NVC, nonviolent communications theory?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we look at that, when we look at like those 16 needs, the prioritization of those needs, it's different from person to person. And a lot of that, yeah, some of it's dependent on like what was modeled for you and your family of origin, but a lot of it is dependent on your own life experience and some of the deprivation of those needs over your lifespan. And I find that these 8 intimacy forms are very similar, right? Like the prioritization of each of those 8 is really dependent on what you feel has been deprived within your relational experiences in the past. So it's not like one predominant one that I find 80% of the couples or partnerships that come to me are prioritizing. It's highly variable, and I think that's specifically why. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Yeah, so like what you didn't get as a child, you end up being hungry for a lot.
Yeah, or even like from your previous relationship, right? Like if you were with somebody who was highly analytical, and your intellectual intimacy was like way met, it was super fulfilled all the time, but your creative intimacy within that relationship was so undermet pretty chronically, you may step into your next relationship feeling like an intensity or an urge to meet that need over any of the other intimacy forms. It's our ability or our drive to seek balance, right? It's all about universal balance.
Sure. Yeah, I remember learning about the different forms of intimacy and being really struck by intellectual intimacy. Like that, it makes sense. It totally makes sense. But I remember thinking like that just wasn't on my radar before, you know?
Really?
Yeah.
What do you feel like is your top? What's most important for you?
I'm very touchy. I'm very physical.
Yeah.
I deeply appreciate like creative exchange. I was raised by artists. So there was always this creative exchange, and it's actually really funny. I used to insist on bringing dates to an art museum because I sought that creative intimacy, and I was like, if you can't measure up here, like we're just not gonna mesh.
The way to filter out.
Yeah. Because if you can't stand in front of a painting and go, this makes me feel a certain way, then like I'm just gonna get bored.
Yeah.
If you walk through a whole museum without feeling anything, we're not a match.
Yep.
You know, and if you can't like articulate it, like that was so much of my intimacy growing up was standing in front of paintings and going, I have this visceral feeling here. I feel conflicted by this component, and I'm really enjoying the synergy over here. And you know, like that discussion was really valuable to me. But I'm so physical. I'm a cuddle monster. So that really is like number one. If it
super connective for you.
Yeah. Like we can have zero creative connection, but if we have no physical connection, it's just like, what are we even doing? Right.
Yeah.
I want to cuddle with all my friends. It's so sad that cuddling is not socially just acceptable with everybody. Like,
oh, I know. Yeah. Because it's an inherent need for all of us, right? I mean, like touch starvation is so, it's so strong like in our culture, right?
it is.
You see it all the time.
It is. I don't like to throw around the word conspiracy, but there is this there are these coalescing interests of isolation. Like so many different corporations benefit from us feeling isolated that we end up getting pulled apart, and now we're all in our own separate little boxes and have to pay for interaction. It's a tragic set of situations.
Yeah. No, I'm with you though. I mean, that's unfortunately a reality.
Yeah. Dystopian and all.
Well, hopefully, right? Like our purpose here is that we're changing that, right? We're healing some of that
Yeah.
darkness and hoping for reconnection in a more global capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the thing that drives me, is that, we can help people feel more at home in their own
Yeah,
skin and more connected with the people around us. Like that is a really noble life's work, I think.
absolutely. Yeah.
If you like the Ask Ezra podcast, then let me know. Comment on your favorite episode. Let us know what you enjoyed or what you'd like to see more of.
How would you describe your like ideal client? Like, wave a magic wand and this person rings you up and it's your favorite person to chat with. What do they look like? What do they need?
I think it's going to be less about a presenting issue and it's going to be more about like how they present. So it's going to be somebody who is motivated for change, which means that they embrace, maybe not like enjoy, but they are accepting or tolerant of discomfort, because there is no change process that comes with comfortability, right? Like that's just human nature. So prepared for discomfort, has already done some of the basics, which means that they're self-aware, right? So for communication, for introspection, maybe some family dynamics work, just foundationally has done some therapeutic work. So we don't have to start from the very, very bottom. We can just dive into some of the more complex stuff, which is really what I enjoy most. And somebody who follows through on like behavioral action, right? So I
Mhm.
am a huge advocate for resources. There, after every single session, I provide a resource email to my clients. Sometimes it's a lot longer than I would like, but it kind of overviews what we talked about, what they committed to between now and the next session, and it has all the attachments for like their action plan essentially. So for them to follow through with what we talked about, the strategies that they will implement to make progression happen, they'll get more out of the process at a quicker pace with follow through that way, rather than just doing therapy essentially only during the little bit of time that we're meeting, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Therapy is all the time. It's just, I'm only with you for a little bit of that time, but it should be a progressive experience throughout the entire week, even when I'm not physically sitting in front of you. So that would be my ideal client.
You mean you don't want to have the same conversation in every session over and over again?
Oh yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah,
I don't,
sometimes that's
yeah,
what people need, but yeah.
yeah. I mean, I'm pretty laid back, but I like change, right? Like
Yeah.
I like movement. I like to see progress and to celebrate the wins. And if we're kind of just stagnating, I don't feel like I'm helping, and I don't feel like they're helping themselves. And that can be really frustrating for all parties. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think I definitely agree with you that like a client who is proactive, a client who has, some resources,
Mhm.
is going to be a better client. My favorite kind of client is the person who is like almost actively holding themselves back from their sexual discovery or their gender discovery, and they just needed permission. And so as soon as we start working together, it's like they're like wrapped up in paper and ribbon to be what the society has sort of shown them they need to be. And we go, honey, like, we don't need that. Like, let's be weird, let's be expansive, let's do it. And as soon as that ribbon and paper comes off, it's this like explosion. And it's this like and so I've seen this transition from like shame and fear to joy and excitement that can happen like really quickly. And that's my favorite. That is like, giving people permission to be like weird and different and unsure. That is just my jam. That is the best.
That's really beautiful. Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that my ideal client is who I was 20 years ago. You know,
Oh,
like
wow.
I really held myself back. I got into like a vanilla marriage because I said to myself, nobody's gonna appreciate what I have. I have to hide it. I have to soften the edges. I have to put myself in that package so that I'll be acceptable. And then I realized that there were all these really weird things that were very, very important to me. And then I really couldn't just live my life as a compromise.
Mhm.
And yeah, so now I have a very strange and bizarre and sexy life, and
And you
is
love it.
it's wonderful.
It's
Yeah, no,
amazing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, every year has been the sexiest year of my life for like the last 5 years. So
And that's what you offer your clients, which is phenomenal.
yeah, and
So
I
cool.
think what's really tremendous is that I don't have to say I'm done. Let me help you get started.
Right.
I'm on the path. I'm working. I am still working on me, and I'm here to help other people not be alone in their journey of being on that path.
I think anyone who promotes like having completed their journey, I would encourage maybe finding somebody else because there that doesn't exist, right? Like we are on a constant evolutionary journey, right? That is human nature, that's human existence. So like you
Yeah.
being on your own journey and expressing like enjoyment in your constant learning of who you are and who you want to be and embracing that process, that's exactly what other people need to see and feel and hear to experience hopefulness that they can experience the same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like to think that there's, if we come back to that activation energy analogy, like I like to think that there's some lulls, some like low energy areas where I can exist for a little while. It's not so crazy, but I'm with you. Yeah, it's a never-ending journey of discovery and growth. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, okay, so that was your favorite client. So what is your favorite like presenting issue, or I would say challenge to address?
Mm. It's hard to pick just one. I mean, I have so many different demographics that I work with. Um, I think the ones that I most enjoy working with is like resentment repair,
Mm,
low or mismatched libido styles within relationships, any kind of holistic management or treatment of disorders, like finding the spice back in a relationship, any kind of like we feel like roommates kind of statements, right? Like those
yeah.
dynamics that come. Um, yeah, I mean, I think I really just love complex cases. So the cases that come to me and they're like, you are my seventh provider. I am tapped out of this therapeutic shit. I'm so done. Um, you're really kind of like the last hope, and I really hope that we can figure all of this crap out. So usually that means them coming to the table and just saying, I have this. They're all hugely problematic. They're all creating massive dysfunctions and disruptions in my quality of life. And we work together to figure out what are the core symptoms and what are all the secondary flurries that were created by the core symptoms.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's the intellectual challenge for me. But we also, in that process, get to develop this really strong bond and rapport, which is important to me, right? Like that's why we do what we do, is to help people. So an example would be if I have a female client, female presenting client who comes in and she has intense anxiety, pretty significant insomnia, sexual difficulties with their partner, just general mood disruption, right? And all of those alone, like singularly, are big issues that we could, if we were taking a linear perspective, like isolate them and say, okay, here's the treatment protocol for anxiety. If it were the only presenting issue, we could spend probably a couple weeks or months just on that presenting issue. But it's not, right? That's why we take a systemic approach, because there's this myriad of symptoms, and we need to figure out what is at the core, right? And what's at the core was that she was getting up 5 times during the night to pee because her pelvic floor was so unstable that her body couldn't, like, it was so unstable that it couldn't sustain urine anymore, right? So she wasn't getting sleep. She was getting like maybe 2.5 hours of sleep at night, which created all of these mood disruptions. And the pelvic instability also created a lot of sexual dysfunctions in the bedroom. And the mood disruptions and the sexual dysfunctions were creating, understandably, difficulties in the relationship. Do you see how everything like spiders and is connected?
Yeah, absolutely.
If we focus on just one of those issues at a time, it would be wasteful. So we have to figure out, it's kind of like investigative work, which is fun and exciting for me as a provider. But then we also get to actually help this person who hasn't been able to figure out for the last like 8 years what has been going on and what the core reason for all of these disruptions are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's an example of like what my favorite kind of cases are, the complex ones.
Yeah, you heard it here first. Dr. Bathurst, the end of your seemingly endless quest for the right provider. If you've already seen 7 other people, this is the one. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. See, what would be my favorite challenge to address?
Yeah.
I think it's shame. You know, I think shame is such a boner killer that if we can get past it, if we can digest it. Yeah, I mean, I lived with so much shame for so long that when I see people suffering for shame, I feel it. I feel it really strongly. And if I can help relieve them, then I feel like I've done my job as a human for the day. If I can remove some shame in the world, or at least give people the tools to remove their own shame, right?
Is there a specific approach that you use, or is it really dependent on the person's personality?
I mean, it's always, acknowledging and validating. Like what I think Brene Brown said, that shame dies in the light. Right. And so when we share our stories, they are not so heavy.
You disempower it.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other component is like this desire to fit in. I think is a really strong social need to fit in. And the reality is that normal is an illusion, and we're all different. And when we can celebrate that difference, like, I think a lot of kinky people will think that they're in the minority, but if you look at the Kinsey report, half of people bite during sex. And I think we think that's pretty kinky, right? And that's just one thing. So we're already looking at less than 50% of the population is not kinky, right? And it's probably a really small minority, in fact. Everybody's got something. Everybody's got something, breasts are not sexual organs, right? And so everyone who finds erogyny in breasts is actually fetishizing breasts. Who knew?
I know, right?
The most socially acceptable fetish in the United States, at least.
I think going through those, sometimes it is statistics, right? Just calling them out, because they are really surprising for a lot of just like lay people, right? And I remember like going through my dissertation, and which was on ethical non-monogamy. And the research showed that 1 in 5 relationships will venture into an ethical non-monogamous structure within its lifetime in the US. And that's by report, which we know because of the taboo, right? The stigmatization of non-monogamy right now. that is way underreported. So
Mm-hmm.
1 in 5 relationships, it's very normal, right? But it's still feeling like the clients that come to us and maybe they don't have networks around them that are open about being more poly or just non-monogamous. It feels really surprising and very normalizing to receive some of that data.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and I think also if you think about infidelity as non-monogamy, then
Yeah,
I mean, it's almost ubiquitous.
yeah.
People like to talk about, oh, I was faithful to my first wife and my second wife and my third wife. I was monogamous with all three, and it's like, I don't know if that really is what you're talking about. Like, sea turtles are monogamous. Like, oh,
No.
my partner died, I'm alone forever, and it's 100 years because they're sea turtles. But
Oh,
I
I
mean,
didn't
the
know
rest of us,
that.
yeah, yeah, sea turtles are
Oh.
monogamous. Um, and it's actually really challenging to find true monogamy in nature.
Hmm.
Um, you know, but yeah, well, I think most people are serial monogamists,
Right.
right? And it's just a matter of overlap. That's all.
Yeah.
It's the only
Yeah. I mean,
difference.
the term of commitment is super subjective, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
when we're relationally contracting, that love, commitment, loyalty, like all of those, romance, all of those things that we assume because we're using the same verbiage, the same language, means the same thing
Mm,
between ourselves and our partners. It usually does not. Like that has to be openly discussed and defined because the subjective nature of that language is oftentimes opportunistic for conflict, right? Like we got to lock that down in the contract of the relationship so that
yeah.
we know when we're talking about these really important things and structures, we're having the same conversation, not like 3 or 4 different conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, yeah, the start of any good discussion is an establishment of vocabulary.
Right. Yeah. What are we talking about? Yeah.
Fantastic. You also mentioned on your website the emotional freedom technique. Can you tell me about
Mm.
that?
Yeah. So emotional freedom technique it's also called tapping. So it's an evidence-based practice that is it's essentially acupressure. So they have studied uh, different tapping points across the body that all focus on the 5 meridians, which are the energy lines within the body.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 11 main acupressure points that are used in EFT or tapping to kind of move the energy. And based on Eastern medicine, it's theorized that underlying symptoms, whether it be somatic or physical or emotional, symptoms are just kind of our body's way of communicating blockages of energy. So by us tapping this sequence of points, which activates all 5 energy lines, we don't have to be with an acupuncturist who has extensive training and knows the exact point of where the blockage is. We actually activate movement in all of the energy lines of our body by doing these 11 points. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And that's been my experience that these, emotions reside in the body, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to look into that.
It's fantastic. You find like a grounding affirmation to so if you're wanting to say alleviate anger, right? If your anger is at like an 8 out of 10, you just have to every time that you switch tapping points, right? Say anger or reaffirm anger, so that you're every time that you're switching the points, you're regrounding, you're re-anchoring into the intention of the energy movement.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And there are no negative side effects at all. You can do this back to back to back to back until you get to a more functional place, right? Maybe you get to like a 3 out of 10 for your anger. It's alleviated it from an 8
Mm.
to a 3. And you're like, okay, this is much more manageable. Good to go. I'm going to get back to my life right now. Or sometimes it transitions from a secondary, because anger is oftentimes a secondary symptom. I'm sorry, a secondary emotion.
Yeah.
Yeah, into a more primary emotion like sadness or powerlessness or fear or pain, right? And maybe it'll be an amplified one because it's more primary now. So maybe it's a 10 out of 10 sadness, and you just restart the sequence, which is very, very quick. And then you can do that sequence a couple times to alleviate the intensity of the sadness.
Wonderful.
So it's a great physical practice for emotional regulation and expression.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting.
Yeah.
And you don't need to get acupuncture needles or hot
Nope.
stones.
Yeah.
It's just fingers.
You can do it. Yeah, you can do it in your car, at home. You don't need a professional. I teach it one time. I give the handout for where the points are, and my clients are self-sufficient with it, which is phenomenal.
Awesome. Yeah. Fantastic. What do you have going on that people should be aware of?
So I offer therapy coaching, integrative medicine for mental health, pelvic floor conditioning programs. But right now, we also are offering a hybrid 3-month program for relationship synchronization. So it's a 4-step, 4-module program that is both online with training modules and group video coaching and intensives with one-to-one intensives with me. So it's kind of like a whole picture 3-month program. And then we're also offering couples retreats, advanced couples retreats in Oahu, Hawaii. The next one is coming up in June.
Awesome. And how can people get a hold of you if they'd like to learn more or engage you for services?
Sure. We can be reached on my website, which is bathurstfamilytherapy.com. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. I think the best and the quickest way is to just send us an email if you have any questions or you're wanting to get signed up. And we're at bathurstfamilytherapy@gmail.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for showing up and for telling us about what you do. And
yeah, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching the Ask Ezra Intimacy Coaching Podcast. Support our show at patreon.com/askezra. Join us at the personal growth tier and receive a special thank you on the next podcast episode. A very special thank you to both Sarah Nash and Deb Matson for being Patreon supporters at the personal growth tier and helping make the Ask Ezra Intimacy Coaching Podcast possible.